I had been enjoying shooting outside, but wind is a constant concern on the Mendocino coast, and I've elected to shoot inside to preserve audio quality rather than enjoy the picturesque environment. I've spent the majority of the time that I've told stories talking about the places I was early in my term. County Jail, San Quentin, High Desert, and to a lesser degree, SADF, which is New Corcoran in Corcoran, California. But I did serve time at both Chino and Chowchilla later in my sentence. Chino was an interesting place to serve time because it was set aside as a yard designated for transgender inmates who had contracted HIV. HIV and the more advanced form AIDS are not the death sentence that many people think they are, especially in a prison environment, which is very controlled. The fact of the matter is that HIV is just an illness, and the people who have it are just people who have an illness, unless you are engaging in unprotected sex with them or sharing needles with them. Your likelihood of contracting the illness is very low, and I ran into a lot of inmates who were scared to be on that yard because of the prevalence of HIV positive inmates, and I considered it to be a very ignorant fear. A good friend of mine on this yard, Michelle, had been a prostitute from a horrifyingly young age in Hollywood. At the age of 16, after 6 years of working the street, she had been attacked by two men who jumped out of a pickup truck with bats. They were engaged in what's commonly called a gay bash. Because she'd lived on the streets in Hollywood for 6 years, and this was a rough life she'd lived, she learned to defend herself proactively and shot them both with her pistol, wounding one fatally. Whenever she told this story to me, she was visibly upset and insisted that she hadn't meant to kill the guy. And I believed it because she was upset that she had killed the guy. He was an adult running at a 16-year-old with a bat. That's practically community service as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately, rather than calling the cops and explaining the situation because she was a prostitute, Michelle decided to flee the scene of the crime. And she spent the next 4 years on the run, which is quite successful for somebody on the run, but it was a very poor choice because in order to stay on the run, she committed a number of heinous crimes over those 4 years. The last crime that she committed, and the one that she was caught for and that she came to prison for, was a second murder. She knew a drug dealer who had a sizable amount of cash, and she murdered him in cold blood with the intent of taking his money and leaving Hollywood. However, she was caught with the money and charged with both his murder and the murder of the man she had fatally wounded 4 years prior. At the time, I did something I called lifer consultation. Essentially, I would speak with a life-term inmate for a couple of hours about their case and the amount of work they'd put into demonstrating their rehabilitation, how long they'd been in prison, what their parole plans were, this type of thing. And then at the end of it, I would take a guess as to how the board, who had the right to determine whether or not he would parole, was going to take his efforts and what they were likely to tell him, whether they'd parole him or say that he needed to start working on more rehabilitation or find a place to live whenever he paroled, that type of thing. I considered myself to be reasonably expert in this field because I did it a lot, and you'd be amazed how often I made common sense suggestions to people that they found very helpful in presenting to the board. Unfortunately, whenever Michelle got to the end of her story and described the second murder that she had committed and the cold-blooded nature of it, I had to stop and look for a polite way to tell her that she was going to die in prison, that she had no hope of the board letting her out. She was 40 years old at this time, having been incarcerated for 20 years, and she chuckled and looked down and said, Oh, honey, I know. I know I'm going to die in prison. I've got double life. Of course I'm going to die in here. I'll probably die in that bunk right over there if they don't move me. God, what a hard conversation to have with somebody, and what a good attitude she had about it. You see, a sentence of double life indicates that you received a life term and that you then committed a crime and you have another life term on top of that. She received a life term for the gentleman that she murdered by shooting him in the stomach whenever he was running at her with a bat. And she received a second life term for the murder of the drug dealer to steal his money. This means that before the parole board will even consider evaluating whether she has served enough time for the second murder, she has to complete the first murder. And after 20 years in prison, she had not yet finished serving her time for the first murder. This meant that any hope of parole was entirely unrealistic because she'd have to start serving time on the second murder when she eventually finished the first one. As it turned out, there was a bill under consideration here in 2016 whenever I spoke to Michelle, called SB 261. Neither she nor I thought that it would pass because the changes that it was going to make would be too sweeping. It would have noted that people who are under the age of 23 and commit crimes, regardless of how heinous they are, may not be the type of person who would commit that crime as an adult. That the brain develops quite a bit between the ages of 15 and up to the age of 25, and that one of the developments regards long-term consequences and understanding the finality of actions like murder. Mind you, the board is not compelled to release anybody because of their youth, but this law would make it so that the board would give great weight to the idea that somebody had been young whenever they committed a crime and were under duress, and that maybe they wouldn't do it again as an adult. As it turned out, SB 261 passed, though neither Michelle nor I had expected it to. And over the course of the 2 years that I knew her, I got to go from quietly and sadly telling her that she was going to die in prison to doing a little dance with her whenever she went to the parole board and they acknowledged this new law and said that not only were they granting her complete parole for the first crime, the guy with the bat, that was done, but that they were going to note that she had behaved admirably while serving a sentence of double life and engaged in rehabilitative programming, and that she would have to come back in a couple of years so that they could consider releasing her for her second murder. This was an incredible change of circumstances, and as it turned out, because I maintained some contact with Michelle, I know how the story ends. You see, I had been acquainted with her because she was the lover of my neighbor, New Jersey. New Jersey was also HIV positive, and New Jersey's boyfriend on the streets, who we called the Whale because he was quite wealthy and for another reason that was just between him and New Jersey. He was sexually voracious, and he was excited that Michelle would be paroling because they knew each other just a little, and he thought that she was very attractive and liked the idea of having somebody move in who he might be able to pursue a relationship with without having to worry about the disease. I don't know the very end of the story, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume that Michelle got a happy ending, a happily ever after, because if I met somebody in my term who I felt like kind of got a rough hand and might deserve a happily ever after, it was definitely her, and she was doing what she could to earn it. Because she had hope. I told her to give up hope. I said, "You're going to die in prison. I'm sorry." I was a fool. I didn't see any way that it could work out for her, but I guarantee you whenever she was saying, "Oh, I don't think SB 261 is going to pass," there was a little piece of her that hoped it would and that kept thinking maybe it would, because hope springs eternal. That's what they say, right? Thank goodness it does. The poet said, "Don't go gently into that good night. Rage. Rage against the dying of the light." Don't give up hope. Whatever your impossible dream is, that thing that you're this close to just being realistic and admitting it's never going to happen, take a moment and dream again. Dream bigger. Because without hope, we aren't the best us we could be. And if you give up hope, you may never find it again.